It's an image. All right.
So Brian, are you in Rochester?
I am. Sometimes I'm in Geneva, but I'm in Rochester today. Today, I'm in the Monroe County Extension Office.
Oh, okay.
Yep, they rent space for me. My program rents space for me in their office. Yeah, kind of like one of the regional people. Yeah. So this image was from your website. I
Yes.
borrowed it here. Is that a Rockland County site?
It's not actually, but
Okay.
Charlie found that photo.
That's a good one because it shows a landscape and water in one picture. So that's nice. And that is from Bear Mountain, Hessen Lake.
Oh, Hessian?
Hessian.
Huh. Oh, that's lovely.
Isn't that a nice picture?
Yeah.
Online today. Will we see when people join in? Will we see their image?
So at the bottom, you can see the count going up participant.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah.
I actually not seeing that, but I'll take your word for it.
Okay, so if you
That's all right. You can just you'll keep track.
yes, yeah, I'll get us started.
All right.
7 o'clock.
Good evening, everyone. This is Suzanne Barclay from Cornell Cooperative Extension of Rockland, and we'll give folks another minute or two, and then we'll get started. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 5th of 9 workshops in our Sustainable Landscape series. My name is Suzanne Barclay, and I'm the Executive Director here at Cornell Cooperative Extension of Rockland. And tonight we're pleased to welcome Brian Eschenauer, who will explain the link between pest management and outdoor water conservation. Since you've joined us tonight, you're likely aware that water conservation is a necessity in Rockland. And that's because our drinking water comes essentially from the rain that falls within our borders and then actually makes it into our aquifers or reservoirs. Normally, we receive about 50 inches of rainfall a year or approximately 4 inches a month. However, for the past 12 months, we've actually seen 65 inches. So we should be fine, right? Actually, no. Because our most recent major storm, that was Hurricane Ida, dropped 4 to 6 inches in one day onto ground that was already essentially saturated. So that means that much of that rainfall that should have gone into our aquifer actually sheeted over parking lots and lawns and went directly into rivers and streams en route to the ocean. So the bottom line is that it's still imperative that we conserve water, especially during the warmer months. The good news is that conserving water in Rockland is manageable. It's something we can do. This is one of the few environmental problems that we can actually make a difference, a real and measurable difference. You can't say that about a lot of environmental issues like plastic pollution, but it is true about water conservation. Water conservation, it's not difficult, it's not particularly painful, and it actually saves you money. Hence, our series focus on conserving outdoor water. All of our workshops are designed to give you specific steps for you to take to reduce water in your own yard and household. So just a few housekeeping issues tonight. Feel free to ask questions during the presentation by typing them in chat, and we'll get to them as we go. And then after Brian's presentation, there's a brief survey that will pop up on your screen at the very end, and we'd like you to please give us some feedback. We will try to end by 8 p.m. So if your question wasn't answered or you have some other feedback you'd like to share with us, just email us at rockland@cornell.edu. I want to thank our funders, New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the Hudson River Estuary Program, and the New York State Water Resources Institute. Also, Ulster Communications Manager Charlie Payne is the person behind the scenes managing tonight's technology. And tonight's speaker, Brian Eschenauer, is a Senior Extension Associate for the New York State Integrated Pest Management Program. Brian's specialty is actually ornamental crops, but he also has expertise in plant diagnostics and pathology, trees, shrubs, and turf. And actually, earlier this year, Brian also presented on our newest Rockland resident, the spotted lanternfly. Brian, welcome, and the screen is all yours.
Thank you, Suzanne. It's good to be here this evening. And yeah, we are going to really focus in on some practical tips. But at first, we're going to get started with the big picture. And as Susan said, if you do have any questions, put them in the chat box and she'll tell me that they're there and we can discuss those as we go along. So this is what we want to protect. Suzanne mentioned it. It's really important as a source for drinking water, for our environment. And so we're going to look at ways we can do that. And we're going to talk about a concern in the past that actually turned out to be something that we were able to turn around, really a success story. So let's take a look at this. And if you're like me, you might have a flashback to chemistry and cringe a little bit when you see something like this. But this is a molecule that is known as DDT. And if you're my age or older, you probably know what DDT is, or if you studied that. But some of our younger audience members may not be familiar with this insecticide known as DDT. It was very effective. It's controlled mosquitoes. And in 1942, when it was introduced, it was considered a miracle pesticide. It prevented malaria. And they've estimated hundreds of thousands of lives have been saved because of DDT. So it was something good. And in fact, 6 years after it was introduced, the person who invented it, brought it to market, Dr. Paul Muller, was granted the Nobel Prize for this invention. But, you know, like so many things that are good, sometimes they can be overused. And that is what's happened. It was effective. It was inexpensive to manufacture. And on the upside, for residual, for not having to reapply, it lasted a long time in the environment. We found that that was also its downfall. But here it is. It was used in all kinds of agricultural settings. And it was put on aerially, and beaches and areas where with mosquitoes were fogged. Can you believe that? People out there, you know, just during the day, all kinds of homeowner products were available, including this one, protect your child, you know, use DDT, I guess was the messaging behind this advertisement. But with so much overuse, and the sole reliance on this pesticide to control pests and not looking at other ways to control pests, we kind of got into a treadmill effect. And that is because in addition to killing the target pests, it was also controlling, it was killing the beneficial species. There are so many beneficial species in crop fields, in our yards, that we don't even know are there. They're helping control the harmful pests. And when we've killed all the beneficial species, then when the harmful pests come back, they really can grow unchecked. And so guess what? We have to spray again. And there's outbreaks of pests that we didn't even have before. And so we're spraying again after those develop. And there's a lot of sprays that happen. And so the numbers increased from before even DDT was around, and we're on this pesticide treadmill. That's what happened with DDT. And then we found later that there were hazards for the environment and for people with the use of this product. But it was used a lot. In fact, in the 30 years of its use, over 1 billion pounds of DDT were used in the US. And that had its consequences, with that being sprayed aerially and washing off from crop fields. It ended up, this long residual pesticide ended up in our waterways, and it accumulated because it's long residual. It accumulated in animals, microscopic animals, and in fish. It stayed in their fat. And guess what? The eagles and other birds of prey consumed these fish, and there were consequences with that. The eagles at the time were laying their eggs, and the shells were fragile and they were breaking. And very few were hatching where the eagles were exposed to DDT, which was in most of the country. So here is a graph that shows what the population of eagles looked like from 1940 when it was introduced to 1960. And I think there were only 400 and some breeding pairs at that point. It got to a really low point. They were on the endangered species list. And then at this time, Rachel Carson wrote her book. She was noticing what was going on, wrote the book Silent Spring, which really captured many people's attention. And through this effort and years of work, DDT was banned in 1962. And fortunately, it has worked its way out of the environment, and there has been a rebound of our breeding pairs of bald eagles. And here it is. You can see it's going way up. It was delisted from the endangered species list in 2007, where this graph ends in 2006. But it's estimated now that the breeding pair, this graph would look very different. In 2020, there were over 71,000 breeding pairs of bald eagles. So really a success story where there was a problem, action was taken, and the environment was able to bounce back. And this, one of the ways that this can happen is, instead of relying on just a pesticide, we want to look at other techniques. And I'm part of the Integrated Pest Management Program, the IPM program, and we really look at all ways to control pests in crops, in home situations, in structures with roaches and rats. We're looking at any place that a pesticide might be used. How can we do that? Using pesticides sometimes, but really as a tool, often as the last resort. And one of the ways is to monitor, to notice problems early on. And if this is in your home garden or your landscape, if you see a few, a little bit of injury, you might want to make note of that. If it's getting worse, you can treat it before it's a huge problem and would require a lot of pesticide, for example, or some other action. We really want to identify the problems. I think this is key. My specialty is plant diagnostics, so I want to know what is causing this before we take any action on that problem. And consider the underlying cause. Is that plant in your landscape stressed? And that's why it's always getting bagworms, or it's always showing up with leaf spots. Is it in the right place? So we're going to consider the underlying cause of what's going on. Maybe it's the soil. Maybe the soil. I know in a previous session you talked about soils, and maybe the pH is off. So underlying causes can be important. And then let's think about the threshold. Is there, there might be a few of a pest insect there, but are there enough to cause a problem that's really noticeable? We don't want to reach for a pesticide, for example, if there's just a couple there. We want to know that they're at a damaging level or going to get to a damaging level. So let's talk about identifying the problems. That's so important. So we have this. I took this picture of this insect on a fir tree, and it looks kind of bad, and maybe an orange and black alligator there, but what is that really? Here we get a little bit of a clue. Look, it's eating something there. It's eating another insect. It's actually eating an aphid. And this is the larval stage of this insect. So this is a beneficial. We know ladybugs are beneficial, but we might not always recognize the larval stage. And so somebody might see that, and maybe want to get their can of spray out. But, that's a good guy. That's one of the allies we have out there in the landscape. In this case, it's eating aphids that are a pest plant. They feed on the plant, and the ladybug feeds on the aphid. So it's one we want to protect. So in our landscape, we can have problems with insects occasionally. Grubs can be an issue, and we'll use that as an example here. So I took this picture of this lawn in the Rochester, New York area, and you can see that brown area in front of the tree there. That actually was due to grubs that were there, white grubs, feeding on the roots and killing the turf. And I was working with some researchers at Cornell's experiment station in Geneva. They actually came up, they wanted to collect some of the grubs. So that's what's going on here. And you can see them when you go down into the soil just an inch or two, and you can see the grubs that are there. But the important part here is that there were plenty of them. They were above the threshold levels, but there's often grubs in every lawn, but they may not damage the lawn. And so it's important to scout and determine if you have enough grubs that might cause a problem. And you would want to do this before it gets to that stage, before it gets to a point where you're seeing any symptoms on the top. So what does grub scouting mean? You would take a 1 square foot area, and you would do this in mid-August or so. You could start in July and go to mid-August, and you would lift back the turf and look for the grubs there. It's pretty easy to see them. They're white and they contrast with the brown soil pretty well. You also might see areas where animals have damaged the lawn, because skunks, for example, want to feed on these grubs. Also, birds might be there interested in eating the grubs. And then when you have that flap of soil up, you want to count. Our lawns can handle, in a 1 square foot area, up to 6, 7 grubs in a square foot, and you're going to see absolutely no damage to that turf. The lawn can handle that. When it gets above 8 to 10, then it's at a level where you might want to treat. And if we have a year like this, where our lawns are not exposed to drought injury, we can even tolerate more than that. So, and then we would treat based on knowing that we really need to. And even in a lawn that has grub damage, it's not everywhere. So sometimes we can target just to those areas of the lawn that have the grub damage. And it's also, and this is an area where there was some, it's really easy, because they're cutting off their roots, to roll back that turf and just count them there. There are a bunch of them right there on the top of the soil. But when we think about an insect like this, I think it's helpful to know what's going on with that insect, to really see what's happening through the year. So this graphic helps us do that. So right now, the grubs are actively feeding. We're in that September, October timeframe. But as the temperatures cool down, the grubs will stop feeding. They'll go down away from the frost zone, several inches into the soil. And then next spring, they'll come out, and with the warmer temperatures, they'll go up into the soil, they'll start feeding just for a little bit, and then they'll turn into a pupal state, which is their own form of a cocoon. But instead of as coming out as a butterfly, they'll come out as a beetle. And that beetle will feed on, if it's a Japanese beetle, it'll feed on a lot of different things in the yard, crab apples, roses. They're not too particular. Some other grubs that also damage the grass can come out as European chafers, which don't feed at all. They just use the stored energy they got when they were feeding on the turfgrass roots. And this is an example of European chafer. It's one of the common grubs that we have around, and this is what it looks like as an adult. And they fly around. Here we can see them flying around at night. They do that around tall objects in the landscape, and they mate, and the females lay eggs. But with these insects, and with any insect, there are natural predators and natural fungi that feed on these insects, and sometimes we can take advantage of those. So for the grubs, there are some nematodes, so these microscopic worms that feed on the grubs and help control them naturally. There's also something called milky spore that will control Japanese beetles. And here's just a dead grub that was killed by some of the entomopathic nematodes. And here is one that has been infected. The one on the right has been affected by milky spore. And there's even a third one that's out there, another fungus that feeds on grubs. So some of this is taking place naturally, and there are some newer products that we can apply, like the BTs and the milky spore, that can help augment what's already naturally happening. And even as adults, sometimes, especially in rainy years, so this may have occurred more this year, we'll see fungi affecting the Japanese beetle adults. And one thing that I mentioned is tolerance. And I think this is a good concept to have in mind, that we don't need to control every insect. For grubs, for example, we know we can have a pretty good number out there, and we're not even going to know that they're there and they're not causing a problem. So our goal is not to kill every last grub there. If we do, we're going to start to affect some of our beneficial insects. So that's true for grubs and really anything where we're trying to reduce a pest. And our goal, tonight is to talk about, pesticides and trying to keep those out of our water system. And we're talking about lawns, and one of the ways to protect lawns or to protect water quality is to grow a healthy lawn. And I know one of the previous sessions you had Dr. Frank Rossi, who is an outstanding educator, and he's done a lot with TURFGRASS. You might even see some of his images here, but it's worth talking about because this healthy lawn really protects the water quality, because a lawn like this is not going to allow water to sheet off. It's almost impossible. There's a little slope here in this picture. I don't know if you can tell, but it's almost impossible to get water to sheet off because the lawn is so good at capturing that and causing the water to infiltrate. And that's what we want. It's going to go into the groundwater. It's not going to sheet off. If we have a poor quality lawn, and this happens to be an overused athletic field, so it's not on a slope, but if it were, the water would sheet off. It would go into the stormwater runways and into our streams and rivers, eventually the ocean, carrying with it soil particles. And those soil particles can include phosphorus, they often do, and that could lead to eutrophication, which we'll show later. So that is where we have that harmful bacteria that builds up, and also possibly the lack of oxygen that could cause a fish kill. So one of the most important factors for maintaining a healthy lawn and having a thicker turf with fewer weeds is the way that we're mowing. And this can conserve water as well, the amount of water we need. So we want to mow right, 3 inches or higher. So maybe you're mowing your own lawn, maybe you have somebody mow it. I want to ask them, for your lawn, it's really going to benefit everybody's lawn to bump that up a little bit. I like to see it at 3 inches. It still looks good. It still looks nicely clipped, but it's so much healthier for the lawn and then really for our environment. Leave the clippings because they're a source of fertilizer. You're going to be fertilizing the lawn by leaving the clippings there. If you think about it, everything a blade of grass needs is in that blade that you cut off, letting it return to the soil. It's a natural form of fertilizer, and you don't want that going, you don't want to waste that or to have that go into our waterways or landfills. Having a sharp blade is important too, and we'll take a look at that in a second. But we want to adjust the mowing height. They even have some of these cards that are out there, so you can, instead of putting a ruler down, you can use one of these to measure your grass. We're shooting for something above 2 inches, 3 inches really is ideal. And you might say, well, you know, I go to the golf course and the putting green, you know, that's a 1/4 of an inch or lower. And yeah, you can do that, but as the mowing height decreases, the maintenance level increases. So at that putting green, that often during the summer is watered twice a day, and it's mowed every other day, and it's fertilized probably on a weekly basis. So you have a shorter root system with a shorter blade, and you have to baby that lawn. Left alone in a short period of time, a putting green, if it was maintained at that height, would turn brown and die out. You really need a lot of maintenance with a shorter grass. There's another reason too, and that is mowing higher shades the ground below and reduces the amount of weed germination and weed competition. So you can see when it's mowed at 2.5 inches or above, you essentially create a canopy that shades the soil below. Just a shot of a short mowed grass, and you can see the weeds and the off color that's there. And here it has both. Further away from the sidewalk, it's mowed higher. You have a darker green grass compared to what might have been scalped there closer to the walkway. And
Brian,
yes.
Excuse me, I do have a question.
Sure.
While we're on lawns. And so a participant asked, is it possible for us to embrace the concept of a healthy lawn, including lots of weeds that produce flowers and food for wildlife and doesn't require amendments? Yeah,
you know, that's a good question. And I would say absolutely it's possible. But it's a culture shift, isn't it? Because I think, you know, many of us maybe have felt some responsibility in the neighborhood to prevent dandelions from showing up. And I do have, not in this presentation, but I have something to that point where it shows daffodils in the spring with their bright yellow color that we like to see after a long winter. And then, you know what, the same color is dandelions, but yet we don't want those in our lawns. So that gets to a deeper psychological question on why we like one and not the other. But I like your question, and I think it's challenging for us to all think about, and maybe, you know, our own perception, and maybe try a little bit of relaxing our, you know, monoculture standard that we have for our lawns. I wanted to also mention that, you know, leaves can be a pollutant, really. And so we don't want to dump them into water. If we have a stream nearby, we don't want to do that. But even with the grates in the road, the storm sewers, the leaves actually have a lot of phosphorus. And if we mulch them up, when there's not too many of them there, we can incorporate that in. The pieces of the leaves filter in between the grass blades and serve as a natural fertilizer, and then we don't have to dispose of them. I realize sometimes there's so many leaves at one time that this isn't going to be possible, and we can't just leave all types of leaves there, because they can, if not removed, and there's enough of them, smother the lawn, and then we could end up with that situation where we have bare soil eventually, and we don't want that. But yeah, consider mulching the leaves as a possibility in some areas. And here you can see the bits of leaves. There are some trees that have small leaflets, honey locust, for example, and those leaves can filter down through the grass and don't need to be raked at all. Still talking about mowing, I want to talk about a dull mower blade. Can you see this here? This is the what happens with a dull mower blade. Instead of it nicely clipping off the grass blade, it frays the end, and that creates a greater surface area on that grass blade, which loses more water, which requires more irrigation. So a sharp mower blade can make a difference there. And they've found that the mowing is less efficient and it actually uses more fuel, up to 25% more fuel if you have a dull mower blade, and that much less if it's a nice sharp mower blade. So at least once a year, if you're doing your own lawn, sharpen those mower blades. Often the lawn care companies do keep up on this because they know it doesn't look good when the lawn is mowed with a dull mower blade. And just in review, you want to mow right, 3 inches or higher, leave those clippings, have a sharp blade, and if you're going to mow like this, wear a helmet. Do you know there are actually lawn mower races in some places in New York? Anyway, let's talk about irrigation. So I took this picture a few years ago, not this year, because pretty much across the state, we've had plenty of rainfall. So we didn't see anything like this, but this is when a lawn is just going dormant. You can see the footprints there that remain. And that is because there's not the water pressure in the grass blades. So when they're pressed down, they don't bounce back. And that's an early sign that you might have a lawn that's starting to go dormant. And lawns can go dormant, and it's fine for them to do that in the summer. You don't have to bring them out of dormancy if you have an area that's not irrigated. If it lasts longer than 5 to 6 weeks, you might start to see some of the crowns die out, but that's very, very rare to have a drought for us that goes that long. Here is a field at Cornell that they let go dormant, and then they started to add the irrigation and they brought it back within like a week and a half. It looks nice and green again. So don't be concerned about dormant lawns, but if you are having an event on the lawn, a dormant lawn doesn't handle foot traffic well. So bring it out of dormancy before you're having a lot of foot traffic in that lawn area. So here's irrigation in an athletic field. Let's talk about it in a home landscape where you might have something like this, or you might have an irrigation system. And it's best if you can water early in the day. If it's done during the heat of the midday, you can lose, estimates are of about 30% of the water never makes it down to the root zone. It's lost to evaporation. If it's a hot day, it's just gone right up into the atmosphere and not down where you want it. So we're going to avoid the midday when possible. We want to determine the amount of water by collecting, and whether you have a sprinkler like this or a sprinkler system, collecting is a good idea periodically, just to know where and how much water you're getting. The rule of thumb is we just need about 1 inch per week. If it's an irrigation system and it's going off multiple times, that's fine, but we want to aim for that total, no more than 1 inch a week, and your lawn will be fine. And then we can think about fertilization. So now is a good time for fertilization. If you're a do-it-yourselfer, putting it on now really makes a difference. You may not even need to fertilize in the spring. And if you are spring fertilizing, you don't need to do it early on. You want to wait until later in May, because in late April and probably most of the month of May, the lawn is growing really quickly. It's hard to keep up. You may need to mow more than once a month, or once a week, I should say. It's best if fertilizer is done after that. And if you can use a slow release fertilizer, that's going to meter it out over a longer period of time. All right, I like this image because it really connects lawn care, landscape care to water quality. And this one is what not to do. And I think it's, good for us to see what can be done. And maybe we can relate to some of these things that are there. And Susan, maybe I'll ask people to put in the chat one thing that they see wrong here, or if you see more than one, go ahead and put that in there, and so we can talk about it. So look at the picture. If you're comfortable putting it in chat, go ahead and do that. And Suzanne, you can tell us what people might be writing in there.
Sure. And Brian, I just want to underscore your comment about 1 inch of water per week.
Yes.
And that's essentially what we get in Rockland. And so actually that was Frank Ross's point. We don't really have to water grass here. We get plenty of water.
Yes. Yes. I agree completely. I mean, there might be an exception if you're starting a new area and you have tender seedlings. You might want to watch that really closely. But for the most part, yes, our lawns are pretty forgiving. They can tap in when they're established after the seedling stage. From most of the time they're out there, they can tap into the subsoil, which has a lot of water there. So yes, glad you brought that up.
So people have said in the chat what they see are clippings going into the storm drain, the
Yes.
irrigation overspray, fertilizing into the street and on the pavement. Everything's going into the sewer, grass, excess water, fertilizer.
Yeah, good. Good. Even it looks like the car has leaked a little bit of oil there. We don't see that as much anymore, but I guess that's possible too. And I think they let the irrigation go on too long. So yes, good. You guys are paying attention there. And when that happens and that kind of thing flows down into the storm sewers and gets into our waterways, we can get this process called eutrophication. And that is where you get a lot of algae growth. And that algae growth is using the nutrients that it gets from the waterways and from originally maybe from our landscapes. And then when the algae starts to die, it uses a lot of oxygen. And that when the oxygen level in the water goes down, that's when we can have fish kills and those kinds of things. We can also have bacteria build up and some of the toxic bacteria because of nutrients in the water. So we want to avoid that. And here's the flip side of that picture where they're doing things in a right way. And you guys caught these things. So I like this one over here. Instead of using a rotary spreader, they're using a drop spreader. If it is a rotary spreader that you're using for fertilization, just make sure you're not getting it on the hard surfaces. And if you do get it on a sidewalk or a driveway, you can sweep it back in and prevent it from running off and going into a storm sewer. Here they're collecting that rainfall or the irrigation water. And here I think they even have an electric mower that can help the environment in another way too, but they're not putting the clippings out onto the road. And they're keeping the leaves also away from the side. And I know some municipalities have the leaf pickup, and the temptation is to put it right out here. It's really best. The lawn can handle this for a few weeks. You can leave the leaf pile right on the edge there, and that'll be fine. We don't want the leaves to work their way down into the storm sewers.
So Brian, in Rockland, many municipalities pick up leaves, but also they make available those eco-friendly paper bags that people use for leaves as well.
Good. Yes. And I think many of the municipalities that pick up the leaves also make a note that not only is it a problem for our waterways, it's also a hazard to have the leaves out in the roadways, especially with bicyclists that might be riding along the edge of the road. So another reason to just keep it here for a short period of time. All right, so sometimes, people will call into the extension offices, they'll be talking to the master gardeners, and they'll be wondering why their lawn is so thin. And this is something that we see a lot, and I'm going to call it the number one cause of really thin, poor turf grass is simply shade. And that is, it could be from a building that's nearby or simply a tree. And that tree that was fine a few years ago may have become big enough that it's casting a lot of shade. And turf grass is like any other plant. It needs to conduct photosynthesis. It needs a lot of light. When that light is intercepted by the canopy of the tree, then the lawn is not going to be good. You're going to have exposed soil and those kinds of things. So it doesn't mean that we want to cut down our trees. It just is helpful to understand that. And we talk about the alternatives to grass there. And not every tree is the same. So a Norway maple is one of the trees that captures the most sunlight and lets the least amount go through. Here's taking a look at the canopy, looking from down below up into the sky with a Norway maple. You can see very little patches of sky there. We can compare that with a honey locust, where we can see big areas that these holes are allowing shafts of light to come down. And you can see we can grow turfgrass just fine under honey locust. And so having a diversity of trees is good. This one happens to be an invasive species, so we probably wouldn't want to plant a Norway maple anymore. But if you have one and it's an important part of your landscape, you can do some pruning techniques. You can have an arborist come in and selectively remove some main branches to allow sunlight to penetrate that canopy. Or if you have a group of trees, you might want to remove one or two if turfgrass is important to you. Here's just another example of a tree that you can have, and you can grow turf under it just fine. That's a larch. And managing turf in the shade, it's important to get the right grasses. So if you're buying a shade mixture, that's going to have a lot of fine fescues, and they're the most tolerant of all of our grasses, but even they need a certain amount of sunlight, and there might not be enough even for them. We can eliminate trees or open their canopy, and they have to do this sometimes in golf situations. I wouldn't recommend it because we can consider alternatives to turf grass. And in an area like this, even allowing the needles to fall and create their own mulch in that shaded area below these white pines is a solution. There are also a lot of shade tolerant plants that can do a lot better than turf grass. Here's just a grouping of hosta. This is actually at Cornell's Botanic Garden. And there are a lot of other plants that are out there. A few years ago, I wrote a publication called Weed Suppressive Ground Covers that was based on some of the research that took place at Cornell. And there's some really good plants out there. One that is grass-like that might have a place, especially like on a steep slope where mowing is not something that's easy to do, is this Prairie Dropseed. It's actually one that has flowers, and those flowers smell a little bit like popcorn. Buttered popcorn is kind of an interesting thing that a grass would have that, a fragrant flower like that. But here it is in a grouping at Swarthmore College. So this area here with the tall grasses, that Prairie Dropseed, doesn't need to be mowed, but it has that even look that the landscaper was looking for there. And it's not an area where, you could hold an event or anything, but there's plenty of that. And so in some really large lawn areas, we can think about not having it all be lawns that we mow, but devoting some of it to a more natural state like this.
So Brian, you did get one comment. You may not be aware, but here in Rockland, we have as many deer as we have people, and they love hospice.
Okay. Point well taken. Yes, you definitely have to factor that in. And I'm sorry about that, because I know that is a very frustrating problem to deal with. There are parts of upstate New York where that's an issue as well. And it's an issue for our commercial growers. I've worked on a project where we looked at some deer repellents that they're trying out. So yes, there are some really good lists of deer resistant plants and ground covers that are out there. Here's just an example of along my driveway of using one of these weed suppressive ground covers called moss phlox. It flowers in the springtime, looks pretty good. And of those that we looked at, this is another one that we think of as a perennial, but we don't think of it really as a ground cover. This is one that's flowering. Actually, I took this picture in Albany on October 30th a few years ago. So it was still flowering well into October. And this went at a time when some of the other plants were killed back by a frost. This is catmint. So there's a lot of varieties of catmint out there, a lot of new varieties, and they have these good purple flowers, and they happen to be really weed suppressive. And so we'll go from the ground covers to talk a little bit about some woody material here in our last few minutes. But I have this picture here. I volunteer with an old growth forest that's actually in upstate New York. And I've had some other volunteers come to me because I know I work with insects and diseases, and they'll say, what is wrong here? Why are there holes here? What's been feeding on that? And you know what? This is exactly what we want to see. We want to see some of this. This means that some insects, most likely on this native white oak, it was a native insect that was feeding on this. And that is a food source for those insects that get consumed by birds, and those birds release droppings that fertilize the soil. So we do want to see some of this. Here are some maples I took this picture of, and this was leaf cutter bees. These trees can withstand this amount of damage without a problem. And actually the damage is kind of cool. That's almost a perfect circle that the leaf cutter bees make, and they take those little sections back to their nests, and I think fungi grow on them and they feed on that. Here are also the same leaf cutter bees, happens to be on red buds, and so you can see them working there. Again, we don't want to panic when we see this. We want to know that nature is at work, and yes, we're going to let some of our insects, some of our caterpillars, some of our pollinators eat a little bit of the trees and shrubs in our yard. So they are a food source for our native insects. Native insects are important food source for native birds, as I mentioned. And those native plants are also often well adapted and require less water and care. So we can conserve water that way, and they can provide food and shelter for other wildlife. So those native plants really provide quite a service in the landscape. Yep. And it can be important because we're hearing about the die-off of some of the insects, and that the people that keep track of the numbers of insects have found that they've declined. So having some native plants there so that our native insects can feed on them, that can be a good thing. And as I mentioned, that's leaf cutter bees. There's some things you can do, like making these little nests that allow the leaf cutter bees to bring those leaf sections in and reproduce there. But I don't like to get too legalistic about it, because my landscape is a mixture. And I know Nina Bosick has been part of this series, and she said appropriate plants may be native to the local environment or non-native. And a regionally native plant may actually be a poor choice if it doesn't match the site requirements. So if we have some of our plants being native, that's a good thing. I don't think we need to think about ripping out anything that may not have been native here. And in fact, in Rockland County along the Hudson River, most of that area before the Europeans arrived was a dense forest. And so it was only shade plants that were there. And so if you're talking about that small climate area, you know, we wouldn't have much choice on what to grow there. So I think we can think broader about it, but including some of those native plants is probably a good idea. And there are some great lists out there of native plants to our northeastern area. I don't know, that's probably a good place to stop. Is there any other questions that anyone has or comments? I'd love to hear your comments or experiences as we wrap up.
I don't see any comments yet, but let's give the audience a moment or two.
All right. I will mention that, you know, the one thing that we want to avoid is the non-native invasives. And, you know, there are certainly a lot of those that are out there. And there are some good alternatives for those invasives that do spread. And that's a whole other topic, but we do want to avoid those.
Yes, actually, we hope to be addressing invasive plants and water use as well.
Okay, good.
Oh, so you do have a question here about spotted lanternfly, Brian, which I know
Okay.
is one of your specialties.
That's my main job these days. So fire away.
Well, why don't you, if you could give us a quick overview of the work that's being done to manage it here in Rockland.
Yeah. So you may know that Orangeburg has an infestation of spotted lanternfly, and the local PRISM, and that's the invasive species group that has some funding by our New York State DEC and has other regional support. They were able to mobilize their volunteers and get certified applicators on site to actually remove some of the invasive plants that were around and make some really targeted treatments to another invasive plant. We're talking about invasive plants, and that is Ailanthus, the tree of heaven, that is the favorite species for spotted lanternfly. They like to feed on the Ailanthus, and if they don't have Ailanthus in their diet, it's going to take them a lot longer to develop, and they're going to be able to lay much fewer eggs. So in Rockland County, they were able to treat some of the Ailanthus in a couple of the hot spots, and it's been a very effective treatment. And though it's used, systemic insecticide is used, the advantage of that is it's very kind on other insects that are around, because it becomes systemic in the plant, and this is a sap feeder. An insect, to contact that insecticide, has to feed on the sap that the spotted lanternfly does. And that's it in a nutshell. I don't know, Suzanne, you're familiar also with what has been taking place. I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, so PRISM, our Lower Hudson PRISM, has taken the lead here, and we've assisted them. So they set up a number of traps in a number of trees along a section of the Orangetown Rail Trail. And these were very awkward traps because they have to encircle the trunk of the tree, because evidently these insects go up to the top of the tree during the day and they come back down at night. So on their way back up, or actually, I think it's on their way down, they're captured. So we actually had 2 Conservation Corps interns this summer who helped us with knocking down the invasive plants, putting up these traps and actually emptying them. And they captured hundreds and hundreds of these insects. So you're right, Brian. I think through PRISM, they've really done a good job of managing this unfortunately spreading insect. I think another problem is that these insects are very high up in trees and they're almost unreachable, you know, unless you have a bucket truck. So that makes it that much more difficult to get at them. You do have another question. Someone asked, do you have any update on jumping worms? Because that's another invasive we have here in Rockland.
Yes, I'm aware that that's around and it can spread. So we want to be cautious when we're moving plants from our yard or giving our plant to a neighbor. And even if a plant has been too long in a nursery, it's possible it could enter a balled and burlap plant and we could introduce it to our yards. And this is a worm that is very active. It's not native here. It churns up the soil and can cause a problem. And we especially don't want to see it in our woodland areas. I know some years it seems like the populations of those decline, maybe because of our winter conditions. So we don't see them in high numbers every year, but they are an issue to contend with. And I think prevention is the best way to stop them. And I know there are people who are working on that more and they're looking into this problem.
And just a follow-up, Brian, on spotted lanternfly.
Yes.
Are you aware of any birds that actually eat these insects or potentially eat the treated ones?
Oh, you know what?
Make them sick.
Yeah, that's a good question. And we actually had this discussion with some entomologists, and there is the toxicity to birds of these systemic insecticides is very low. These just affect something in our insects, in the insect's life cycle or life processes, I should say. And so most of these systemics have very low mammal toxicity. One of them that is used for spotted lanternfly is actually used as a flea control in dogs. So for mammals, we don't have to worry about it. Birds also are not affected by those insecticides. And the birds are generally not eating the ones that die. They fall pretty quickly around the base of the tree. And I don't think the birds are just not attracted to those insects that are on the ground.
And just to follow up, people were commenting on Ailanthus, tree of heaven, which is everywhere. And evidently in the 19th century, it was brought to this country and planted widely, because it grows so fast and it does create shade. So that's why we see it everywhere. And it's also very difficult to get rid of.
Yeah, all that is true. You know, it is a species that is able to handle urban conditions really well. Consequently, there's a lot of it in our cities and urban environments. And it serves a purpose there. It's shade, it's green for anyone who lives in that area, but it does have the downside. It can become invasive, it can crowd out our native plants, and we're really concerned about it now because it is an important food source for spotted lanternfly. It's hard to get rid of. If you just cut it down, it will likely sprout many sprouts. And so you may have more trees than if you had left it alone. So what they are using is very targeted herbicides around the base. It's kind of a hack and squirt technique where you're cutting into it, you know, just getting herbicides on the tree, not into the soil. and letting the tree die in that way. It doesn't have the ability to send up sprouts.
Well, I think that's it for our questions. So Brian, I want to thank you so very much for your very comprehensive presentation and for walking us through the connection between pest management, lawn maintenance, water quality, and water conservation. It's not an obvious connection, so we certainly appreciate how you laid it all out for us. So if I can ask the audience to please take our very brief survey. And again, thank you, Brian, and thank you all for joining us tonight, and have a good evening.
Thank you.